So welcome one and all, and let's begin our class today like we have been recently with day of prayer. So please be with me in the spirit. God, may this time of gathering be one that opens our hearts and our minds to your spirit, to the way that it moves through ancient stories and the way that it touches our lives today. May this not just be an exercise of academics, but may it be heart work that teaches us about faith across time and generations. May this be a meaningful manifestation of your spirit in our lives. In Christ we pray. Amen. Well, welcome friends to, this is our 7th session, so our second to last session of our study of some of the women of the Bible. We've got some really good ones today as well. You know, the first one is Hannah, and I kind of mentioned her previously, or the birth story of Samuel, which is what this is connected to, because there's some interesting connections and debates within biblical scholarship about whether or not this is actually Saul's birth story versus Samuel. But for now, we're focused on Hannah and who she is and what she represents. And it's such a classic, isn't it? There's so many of these Bible stories, right? Of these women who are either older or barren or one way or another, not able to have children, and then through prayer and supplication are able to conceive and then birth this amazing child. It is it's sort of a literary technique, is what it is. To have someone born to a woman in a unique way like that is a way of signaling the importance of this character. Okay, so this is a very common kind of understanding, or almost a trope within literature, and yet it was also very real in the culture. That if a woman was not able to provide children, especially male children, you know, the whole heirs thing, it was very common for a husband to take a second wife. In this story, Hannah, her husband Elkanah, has a second wife named Peninnah. And Peninnah bears all sorts of children, and Hannah is facing a lot of, well, scorn and pressure. And so it's not specifically stated that that's what's happened, but I think it's pretty clear that that's kind of what's going on here. But it's really interesting when you notice, as when we read it, you'll see this, how Elkanah does not reject her. In fact, he really reveres her. He adores her in the way the language is. So there's something really beautiful about their relationship, even though to that point, she hasn't been able to bear him a child like that, or especially a male heir. So Hannah turns to God, and through that supplication, as I kind of already indicated, she is able to conceive. And what's interesting to note, and you'll see some of the way the story is set up, it's interesting to note because she promises, she makes a vow to God. She says, I will give him over in that sort of Nazarite style. Like that's what Samson was, you know, someone that was dedicated to God, basically who will be raised in the temple. But it's interesting to note, and the story doesn't ever make this clear, but there's a lot of reasons you can kind of glean from the story as to why she's doing this. Is it because she really wants to provide her husband a male heir? Well, that makes sense for sure. But it's also very clear in the story, I think, and you'll see this too, that it's also a way of back into acceptance within the community. You'll see the way the story is written. There's a lot of pressure she's facing. So it's not just about providing an heir, but it's about being accepted as a whole kind of contributor, a whole member of that culture, of that society. And, you know, it begs the question, you know, in modern days, you know, women, I think, face different pressures, but there are still some of those where there's a pressure, you know, at times. Now, I do think things are changing, and a lot of women these days are electing not to have children. And that's a wonderful choice for anyone to make, you know, as long as whatever. It's an acceptable choice these days, whereas back then, a little more difficult. But the story never quite makes clear as to what her motivations are, but it's very powerful, you know, what she does, and then what happens with Samuel because of her, you know, because of what she does. And she's sitting right on that line between when the judges are happening, and as you know, as you may remember, Saul is the first king. So she's right on that line of the shift between the judges and into the monarchy. Okay, so that's Hannah. We'll be reading about her. The next one we'll look at is the mother of James and John, the so-called sons of Zebedee. It's really, it's funny. This happens so many times where I even found a detail in here that I hadn't thought of before. Okay, so in Matthew, this mother is mentioned a few different times. She's mentioned as one of the ones who witnessed Jesus on the cross. Okay, and in Mark, that story, that the way Mark tells it, he actually provides a name for one of the three women, and it's Salome. And so some scholars have thought, oh, maybe the mother of James and John is Salome. Look, we don't know, but that's something you may have seen. If it's easier to call her Salome here, we can, but it's not clear. But there's a story in Mark that we're very familiar with when they're walking along the road, and it's James and John that go up to Jesus and they ask him the question, hey, can we sit on your right and your left, in heaven, right? You remember that story. And so Jesus uses that as an instructive, teachable moment. Well, in Matthew, the one we're going to read today, it is the mother. It is their mother that asked Jesus. And for some reason, that had sort of slipped my mind or something. But it's the mother that asks on their behalf of Jesus to get them on the right and the left, okay? So we don't know if her sons maybe put her up to it. We don't know if she's one of those, these days, like a stage mom, the ones that are like trying to always get the best for their kids kind of thing. But the point is, while the story doesn't tell us, she still does something courageous, okay? Women in that culture would not have been encouraged to be so presumptuous as that and to go up and ask such a question so directly. And yet the fact that she's not rejected by Jesus, yes, he uses it as a teachable moment, but she's not rejected, really illustrates the welcome, the embrace that Jesus has of all people participating in the community, in the growth of the community. Because the truth is, these are the kind of questions that most of us would have. This is not an unheard of question. It's not a great, it might be looked at today as well. That's, wow, presumptuous, wrong, not the best question. And maybe that's true. But look, what I try to say in church, what we try to embody in our growth, it's like, ask the questions that you have. Don't pretend you don't have questions if you have them. She had this question, she brought it right up and was not rejected in that question. She was shaped, she was taught in that question, but not rejected. So we'll look at her as a woman who was courageous in the way that she stood up for her children and tried to act on their behalf. And then finally, the famous Samaritan woman, who in her own right is so interesting. But in the context of John, it is so fascinating to compare her to the story that immediately precedes her. And that's the story of Nicodemus, the Pharisee, who goes to Jesus in the middle of the night, in the dark. Okay, this is all metaphor. He's the learned religious scholar who steps out of his sort of category to go talk to Jesus because he sees something in Jesus that the rest of his religious world rejects. And yet in that story, Nicodemus is still in the dark. He's confused. Everything that Jesus talks about, Nicodemus is like, but how can you go back in the womb and be born again? He's so literal. He doesn't quite understand. That whole story has him, that Jesus is going back and forth. And then at the end, Nicodemus goes off. And we don't know what's going to become of him. Now, at the end of John, we find that he has come back. He learns. He grows. But it takes him time. And at this point of the story, we don't know. So the religious scholar comes to Jesus in the middle of the night and is completely in the dark. The so-called insider who should know better, who has all the information, who has all the access, is the one that's confused. Follow this up immediately by Jesus meeting a Samaritan woman at a well in broad daylight. At noon, I think is what it says. Okay, it is intentionally it's creating this tension here. that she is someone that that shouldn't have all the information, that isn't one you want to talk to, that is the opposite of the Pharisee, at least by the standards and the expectations of the day. But when you read that story, she gets it. And she challenges Jesus. She talks directly to him. He engages her. It's a wonderful, rich conversation. As I said, in its own right, you could just look at that story itself and it's still really instructive. But when you compare it and hold it next to that Nicodemus one, which I'm bringing that up because I feel like we know that story. So it's good to hold that together. It just adds another dimension to her story and to what she's all about. And just to make sure that you know, the Samaritans, the reason why, the text says, well, Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans, it has to do with their religious practices. They had a whole different idea of where the temple should be. Their holy mountain was Mount Gerizim. The Jews in the south, it was Mount Sinai, which is where the temple in Jerusalem was, these sort of things. They had different attitudes. When the Samaritans went through their exile, they experienced intermarrying, so it was a mixing of bloodlines. So the Jews to the south looked at the Samaritans as kind of mixed blood. And back in that day, it was really important. Preserving bloodlines was very important to Jews, especially when in their legacy, in their story, their whole identity was wrapped up in that until they got a land to call their own. When they're a wandering people, the only thing that you have that sets you apart are your bloodlines, pure blood, your sort of food practices, and your other, religious practices. That's it. So that's why they were so preserving. That's why they're so-called mistrusting of foreign women. We've talked about this. So there's this natural tension between Samaritans and Jews because Samaritans were like, they were kind of it's a terrible analogy, but the redheaded stepchild of Israel. I don't like that analogy, but it's one that conveys a meaning. So it gives you a sense. But the other thing about this Samaritan woman, there's some speculation about her sexual past, let's say. Whether or not she was part of a levirate marriage, whether or not she was promiscuous, all these different things, they're brought up. But none of them matter as much as the last part of the story. And what matters most about her story is that because of the way that she understood who Jesus was, she goes out and she shares the message. And because of her, people understand who Jesus is. She basically is like one of the first evangelists. It's because of her that they understand him as a prophet or a Messiah or a rabbi. Okay, that's powerful. So she goes out and becomes the evangelist that Nicodemus can't dream of being right now, even though he is a man of the faith. Okay, so these are the tensions that are set up by these stories. Okay, I know that's a lot of information, a lot of material there. And what we'll do is we'll continue as we have been. We'll continue to read one story and then talk about it a little bit and talk about how it connects to us. But that, I think, provides a reasonable background for these three different women. And before we get into reading our first passage, any comments or questions that you have, whether from this or even from previous weeks? Nothing? Okay. All good?
I think you covered it.
Okay. Hey, that works too. Okay, well, just as you know, raise hands and anytime, and we'll address questions. Let's start by if someone online could read the passage from 1 Samuel, and that is the 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. Understanding that we're not covering the entire story, but it gives us a flavor of what she's about. So would someone be willing to read that online? Bonnie, thank you.
Okay. With all these names.
I know, you just go for it.
Okay. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim, Zopan, of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zup, and Ephraimite. Mm-hmm. And he had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival also provoked her severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it was year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? So Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And he was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child. Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of my life, and no razor shall come upon his head.
Thank you. And that begins, and it kind of goes further than that, but that's sort of the definition, that last part there, of the Nazarite kind of offering. That's why Samson, they don't cut your hair at all. That's part of the Nazarite vow when you're offered to the temple like that, and you would be raised in the temple. So yeah, so she makes that prayer, and all of a sudden she is able to conceive, and she receives Samuel, and everything changes for her. But as we consider this, and you see that, and I thought your version really played it out well, Bonnie, where it's like she's getting taunted, and just what that would be like, her rival. It suggests that Peninnah, the other wife, is constantly on her case about her lack, her what is wrong with her, basically, because she simply can't have children. Okay, that is something, again, that is not necessarily as reflective of modern society, and yet, in our own lives, we may well have felt that type of pressure, in your lives, or people for whom it has been a struggle. And sometimes it may not be an external taunting, but it can be something inside, for sure. So it's not, while these things are maybe known in different ways, they're still present, these pressures that women feel to produce, basically. So any kind of comments about that? Anything that you're reflecting on as you're hearing that story? Anything that struck you as new, perhaps, or something you hadn't realized before as you read through that story? Bonnie?
The whole cultural thing about men having more than one wife, and you wonder what's really going on in her mind. I know nowadays, most of us, if our husband took another wife, we'd kick him out. I mean, it would be like, forget this, I'm not going to take this kind of a setup. But in those days, I guess it was accepted, and that they're having children and by more than one woman, and so on and so forth. And you just wonder how accepting were the women really of that. They didn't have anything to say about it, but you wonder if that didn't play into part of this. I don't know.
Well, I think it's a great question to raise, and also one that ends up being pretty speculative, because it's hard to assess the differences between a culture like that, whose identity is so tied up in this whole idea of be fruitful and multiply. they're a fledgling society, a fledgling culture in a lot of ways that is kind of just, trying to carve out a niche for itself. It's a different whole conversation in our modern world where we have 7 billion people in the world, and being fruitful and multiplying is not necessarily the most sustainable way to approach things anymore. There will be a point where we're too fruitful, no more multiplying, that idea. And that's a different conversation today. But in the earlier context, it was all about that. That was a huge part of their sense of self, just identity. And so it does raise the question that women could be accepting of that, even though it's still, you can imagine it being painful to be in a relationship like that, where your value is kind of limited, or at least that there's a focus on whether or not you can have children. And that's about it. Now, interestingly, in this story, the husband is just the way it describes it, it's a very loving relationship that he has with her. Jane?
I didn't realize this part of the story either, where Hannah was ridiculed by her sister wife, and what came to mind for me was, during my generation, I believe that women realized we had to be more supportive of each other in their different roles, because it definitely was a time when more young women were going back to work, or going to work and having children as well. They were both jobs and children, instead of just staying home with their children. And within the school setting and within the church setting and the family settings, we had to really learn how to be more affirming of each other and supportive of each other. There was there was very intentional dialogue around that. Are we supporting each other as women? And how can we support each other as women and their choices? And then I think by the next generation, or even a little bit, then women started making choices not to have children. And how can we as women, and hopefully men too, but how is we as women supporting each other in our choices? I think it became much more intentional.
Thank you so much for that insight. You raised so many good points here. First of all, it is so cultural, isn't it? Different cultures have a whole different way that women maybe for a long time have banded together, or have found a sense of connection to each other. I know within certain Native American cultures, the women were always working together to run sort of the whole community, while the men were the hunter-gatherer types. Important, but the women were the central pieces that kept not only the family together, but the society together. But in our culture, in sort of the Western culture in the United States, to me, that really started to happen kind of post Great Depression into World War II, when the men were gone and the women had to, but then discovered, oh my gosh, how empowering that is to come together, and in the ways that encouraged, okay, we need to really band together now because we're spread a little more thinly, and how do we make all this work? And this coming together it's kind of happened like this. I think we've still gone through a struggle, but I do think that a story like this does kind of raise that question of how do different societies, how do cultures manage these places of dealing with separation, pain, shame, even. How do we band together? And that's part of it, as what your last question was, Jane. Even as we choose not to have children, we can choose not to associate that with shame. Whereas that's what was a big part of this story. And sounds like in our lifetimes, there was still a measure of shame about not having children. That was really important for a while. But now it's, okay, there's no need for shame. It's more about affirming, as Jane said, affirming the life choices and accepting one another in a world that, on a biological level, doesn't really need a ton more people. Not that that's a bad thing, to have, but it's a different reality. I see Marilyn's hand up.
I think today, one of the big differences is that not to have children, you can wonder who's going to take care of me when I am elderly and really need being taken care of. And I try very hard not to take advantage of my daughters now that I'm one of those people. But nonetheless, I so appreciate the help they give me. And I think, God, what would I be doing if I had never had them?
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And that is something that's real for a lot of us as we get to that stage of our lives. And it can be really, it can be nerve-wracking to think about where the care will come. And whether or not you cultivate that in your family, with your children, or in other places, say like a church, where you can try to have some measure of support. That support is vital. And we're not just here to produce, pop out kids and then, it's all, there's something culturally that I hope is shifting, where it's becoming more, or what it is, it's becoming again, the practice where families, it's a lifelong sense of connection. We, back in the 80s and 90s, it just got to this place where we were basically shuttling off our parents, our elderly parents, into these nursing homes where a lot of them received very poor care and attention. And it's like, this is shifting. I hope. I see it in some ways, but I also know that it's challenging. So it is a part, and we hope to cultivate these circles of support, a lifelong support. And certain cultures do a very good job at that. And within Judaism is one of them. Judaism is one of those that really creates this sense of family and mutual care lifelong, and that's, to me, I think as we get older, we see how vital that is. We see how important that is. Bob, and then Bertie.
Well, I would think that would have been important in Hannah's time as
well. No question. Yeah, they needed that sort of lifelong support, and that was an expectation. Is that when you got older, the families took care. You see all these stories, these death stories of the famous patriarchs like Isaac and, Abraham, all these, they're surrounded by their children who are caring for them. It's just a given. Now, understandably, you're living in much more localized areas. We're not moving across, a country, and we're not, where that does change things. It's a different reality. And yet there is a cultural sort of shaping, and I'll call it even an expectation that families do provide that care. So that, I think you're right, Bob, that was sort of a given. Bertie?
If Hannah was getting all of this abuse from the other wife, I think she was also getting it from the children, because they would have heard their mother talking to Hannah poorly. And so I think the whole household was really disrupted with this abuse. And I'm sure it's a cultural thing, but it really bothers me that the husband never stepped in to put a stop to it.
It's a hard thing, because we don't know, but I think you're right. I don't think it was simply Penina that was doing it. It's a cultural thing at this stage. So the pressure she would have felt would have been from a lot of different circles, a lot of different angles. The story presents him, I think, in somewhat favorable terms, in that he's connected to her, he's giving her that double portion, he's expressing his love, he's trying to provide comfort. He doesn't blame her for it. If you notice the way the term is, it's the Lord has closed her womb. That's kind of the way he understood it. And in that sense, it's interesting because when she prays to God, well, then God opens her womb. So that understanding, it takes some of the responsibility off of her. And so he's trying. But you're right, he never kind of comes out. But that's not really typical either. We don't really see too many of those stories where the wife is shamed. And then the husband comes up and says, no, you sit down. She's no, that just doesn't happen. Because that's a little bit more of a modern sort of, psychology as well. Back in this time, it was just you either produced or, that was life is that way, and these stories don't usually go into those details. But I do think what you raised it makes a lot of sense that she would have been facing pressure from a whole bunch of different angles. You know, and these are the types of things in our own lives. We face these pressures. And it's not just about having kids, it's maybe about having a job. Whether or not we should have a job, or whether or not someone says you shouldn't, you should be home taking care of the kids, that sort of thing. We face those pressures. And what we have learned and grown into is is that the best way to manage it? And I think what Jane said, it brings us back to that. And the answer is no, it's not. That creates more of a culture of shame and blame and isolation. And where we thrive is when we can come together. And I think these stories kind of point us in that direction. But I want to ask one other question related to this, and that is, God answers her prayer. Okay? In the context of this story, God answers her prayer. And I want to ask you, in what ways has God answered prayers in your life that you weren't expecting? She wasn't expecting it. This has been her whole life. It says day after day, year after year, it was like this, She's praying this, but you can only imagine that it's not the first time she's probably prayed this, the way that the story goes. But what's it been like for you? In what ways has God answered your prayers, especially when you didn't expect an answer? Can you think of any of those examples? I find myself thinking of the times when I prayed for something specific and then the response was not what I prayed for. Those types of examples, those come up for me. And you learn that in the course of time, there's a wisdom in the response that I got versus what I was asking for. There's lots of examples in my life like that, for sure. Anyone else have something that comes up for you? When's a time that God answered a prayer for you that was quite unexpected?
Horty came into my life.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, tell me, why was that so unexpected?
Well, I struggled quite a while to find a companion as good as her.
I hope she's right there hearing this. Are you there, Horty?
I think she's listening.
Okay, good. It is beautiful. That is true. That love and relationships happen that way for sure. So, yeah, and those are blessings. And it's surprising. And we can get to a place in our lives where we've been praying for something for so long that we just are like, well, I don't even know why I'm praying for this anymore. I know friends that have struggled with addiction. Addiction can have such a hold, and it's easy to give up. And it's not only easy to give up for the person going through it, but it's easy to give up for the circle of friends and family that are support, because you go through it and you put your hope into it and then you get dashed again. And it's hard, but there's a way through that, and that's like, some of these things aren't up to us. I have an example of someone I've been working with at church who has gone through recovery dozens of times. And she got back in the program again. And all of a sudden, when you're back in the program, none of those other times matter. It's just this time. And if you can do that, it gives you the permission to let go of some of the past pain. Not all of it, but most of it, or maybe all of it, but just let go of it enough to allow it to be what it is now, and to trust that it's not always up to us, the answer, the healing, the wholeness. We're a part of it. And that's where, okay, this isn't all up to me. So go, and God's blessing be upon you, and may it stick this time, kind of thing. I've learned that to kind of have that approach to some of this, especially when I found myself frustrated at what feels like just a repeat pattern, all the time. Any other thoughts about this? These times in your life where God answered a prayer that was sort of just unexpected. Bob is Mr. You're going to get a star today for participation, Bob.
Oh, thank you. It's one of those. It's quite unexpected. So Horty also brought me to this church, and I was trying different ones, and this one's a good fit.
There you go. I think I've heard a lot of people say that, and that's a beautiful thing. And you know what? I love that. I adore hearing that. Actually, that is what makes me feel so alive in my ministry. But I've also learned that there's certain times where for certain people, it's not the best fit. And sometimes people leave and they go find another place. And I've learned to just say, to not take that so personally. Oh my gosh, did I used to take that personally? Oh, I was always a reflection of me, or somehow that I could have done more. And I think there's a lot of us in church that still feel that way, whether we put it on ourselves or we put it on the leadership. Say, why did they leave? Or why aren't there more of this type of people here, or young families, or whatever? Those kind of questions come up, and it's hard. But for the perspective of those that come and then leave, I've learned to be more graceful and just trust that the way God moves, the way the Spirit moves in people's lives, the different flavors and connections just work at different times for people differently. So I've learned to trust that. And so that's more of us to let him go, I think. And that helps so much. But yeah, I appreciate that a church like this can be an unexpected place, an unexpected gift in our lives, Heck, a lot of us were raised in church where we just sort of show up on Sunday and then we go home. It's an hour a week thing. But this church asks us to come on Tuesday mornings and sometimes Tuesday nights and Thursday nights and all sorts of days and times. So Friday nights for gathering in and Saturdays for cleanup. All these different times and places that we have opportunity to surprise ourselves with how we can get connected with each other and with our community. Any other comments, Marilyn?
Yes. Well, I want to echo what Bob said. I had been searching and searching and searching. I really had kind of given up the thought that I would ever really find a church where I didn't sit in the pew arguing in my head with what was going on the whole time. That was what I was looking for.
Yeah.
And I moved here to be near my family and started coming. I mean, my sister Bev would invite me and I came and it was so different right from the very beginning. And that was a whole bunch of years ago. I moved here in 2009. And I actually moved from Grass Valley to Auburn recently. So I didn't have to drive half an hour each way to come to church events. And it's an experience that Sunday carries me through the whole week.
Right.
So I may not come back for some of the other things, but the influence of the church is just so strong in my life. And that's definitely God's work.
Yeah.
And yet I wasn't really praying to find a church. I had given up and I thought, I'm just have to, I became a Buddhist and I became so I was still searching for spiritual kinds of contacts. And, but I'd pretty much given up on finding a church for myself. And all of a sudden, here I was.
And that's, in those types of times or those seasons of our lives, sometimes the prayer is the act of showing up.
Mm-hmm.
Not always an articulation, more than that. And so, I'm certainly glad that you showed up. I'm glad you all showed up, both on Sundays and for this. This means the world. And the way that it touches us and it fills us, as you said, it impacts a lot, many other people. And we may not be aware of it, but it does. It impacts people because you just sort of start to, you get imbued with this shine, almost this feeling, this filling, and then it comes out in certain ways. And we'll talk about in a few questions in a different section. What are some of the ways that it comes out? But I'd like to move because the timing, I've just noticed sometimes I don't realize that we've just talked for that long. But anyway, I'd like to move to the Matthew portion. It's a shorter one. The Matthew text is about the mother of James and John. Would someone from the room read that? It's Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 22. One of you in the room like to read that? No.
Okay, I will.
Okay, Teresa says,
Okay. Then the mother of Zebedee's son came to Jesus with her sons and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. What is it you want? He asked. She said, grant one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other on your left in the kingdom. You don't know what you are asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? We can, they answered.
yep.
That was it.
Yeah, thank you. And that's it. And it's a taste of the entire thing. But yeah, it's so different than the Mark version, where they ask themselves. And in Mark, they say, yeah, sure, we can. And it's this sense of false bravado in the context of Mark. Whereas in Matthew, it's more of, it's a little different, slightly different sense. Although in Matthew, the disciples also have kind of a mistaken appreciation of what it really means. Because again, at this point, even, there's still this idea that Jesus isn't really going to have to go through it. He keeps saying it, but their ability to accept that is still in question. But this whole interaction, so I just love the way it's presented here with her kneeling down, that sign of respect, and asking Jesus a question like this. And again, it's important to note, he does not reject her. He asks her what she wants, and he simply uses it as a way of instructing. It's more of a nudge. So he's never saying, oh, what a terrible question, get out of here. He says, no, that's not for mine. And do you think you understand what this is all about? He's going deeper, okay? He uses it like a wonderful teacher who's always trying to find ways to get people in, okay? But it brings up the question, she asks the question that she has. Okay, may not be the best question. It's easy for us to stand here in our modern context and say, oh, that is terrible. Who would ask such a thing? That's so unimportant. But it doesn't matter. And it makes me wonder, what are the questions that you have that you would like most to ask God? And even, what are the things that you think God would want you to ask about? Not that it matters, but a lot of times we have this tension, like, well, I have this question, but I think it's dumb, or I think it's one that's not appropriate, okay? So we have this idea that God wants us to ask these big questions, when to me, God just wants us to ask our questions. God invites our questions, all questions. Do you have questions that you either want to ask of God or find yourself asking of God? Whether or not they're good questions, it doesn't matter. What are the questions you find yourself asking God? Marilyn?
Oh no, where are my keys?
Wow, that's a good one. Where are my keys? Where's my wallet? Where's my car? Where's a parking space? Please find me a parking space, God. Yeah.
And the thing of it is, so often, all of a sudden, it occurs to me to look someplace that I hadn't looked at for them yet. And there they are.
And that's an illustration, maybe, that God's helping us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily think that's happening, but I do think when we dare to ask whatever the question is, it clears space.
Mm-hmm.
It opens us to a different possibility of perception.
Mm-hmm.
It opens us. It clears it out. Nothing worse than that question or some thought that's rattling around our head unexpressed. That's why we stay up at night. That's why people recommend, if you're up in the middle of the night and you're just thinking, go write it down. Why? Because it clears the space. It gives you permission to say, okay, I haven't just lost this thought. I haven't just forgotten it. I've attended to it. I've expressed it. I've gotten it out. And I've cleared space. And oftentimes that does help us go back to sleep. Now, I don't do that. I just pretty much lay there. Sometimes I do that, just because, well, I'm like, oh, if I get up, I can start talking through. But it does tend to work. And just in the same way that expressing a question, asking a question tends to open us up.
Can I say a little bit more? I'm trying real hard not to overthink things and decide, oh, that's not God, Marilyn, that's not really God. Well, but then I can get in the habit of saying that every time I ask for something and get an answer.
Yes.
So I just kind of just accept it. Oh, good, I've got my keys.
Good. And it's so true that we can silence ourselves by berating our questions or our thoughts. And sometimes that happens, like I said, internally. Sometimes it's the world that tells us that our questions and our thoughts don't matter. To ask the question we have is to affirm that we matter. It brings me up to the beautiful share you had last week, Cecily. I see she's with us. Her camera's not on, so I don't know. I think she can hear me. But that we matter, and we certainly matter to God. So whatever the question is, we have permission to ask it. Look at all the bad questions that Job asked. A lot of good questions too, but he asked all sorts of questions, and his friends asked questions. Those questions were never rejected; they were received. They were countered, but they were received. Our questions are never rejected, okay? There's no such thing as a bad question. The only bad question is the one we dare not ask, the one that we just don't express, because we trust that that's how it works. If we keep asking, if we move through the so-called not the best questions, we're going to get to the deeper questions. It allows us the permission. And that's what we need to do in terms of our expression, and then the space we create to give each other permission to ask whatever the questions are. Because we never know. Sometimes a question that we think is really silly will lead us down this incredibly powerful path. That happens all the time. So we make these prejudgments that aren't usually very relevant. So that's an important one for this story. She is not rejected. She's courageous to do this. That is a bold move, to step up to Jesus like that and ask that question. Again, it's an important part of what a life of faith is. How about this? Why is it, do you think, why is it that so many of us, certainly in this story and in our own lives, why is it easier to ask a question on behalf of our children than it is to ask for something that we want for ourselves? That's what she's doing. She's stepping out there, risking something for her children. And the truth is, a lot of us do that. We can ask a question that's difficult like that on behalf of someone else that we love, but it's harder to do it when it's about ourselves. Why is that? Why do you think? Bonnie?
Well, I think when you want something for your child, you really want them to have the best. And if you're asking for yourself, then you start to think, well, am I being selfish? Do I deserve this? You certainly think your children, in most cases, deserve it, but you may not think that you yourself deserve something, or that maybe there's somebody better, or whatever. I think it seems selfish and not that important, but it may seem more important to you that your children have whatever it is you're asking for.
Yeah, I think that sometimes when we ask for stuff for ourselves, it often can fall into that, just where we can go into shame or guilt or just judgment about what we're asking for ourselves. We're taught, again, comes back to that our requests aren't as important, or that it's, we shouldn't be asking that for whatever thing. And the truth is, when we ask questions about our kids, we don't tend to go there. It's not about that. It's about knowing that we're helping them to grow. We want them to grow and be whole and wonderful in the world and connected, So we ask things on their behalf, and we trust that that's a part of the process, but we seem to lose that when it comes to ourselves.
It's selfish. It's selfish.
Yeah, we judge things as if asking stuff for ourselves is selfish, and it's just not true. How else do we get what we need? How many problems are created in our lives whether it's in our marriages or in our best friend relationships, how many problems are created because one or both of the parties involved aren't expressing clearly what they really want and what they really need? And something just fell off the wall as if to accentuate my question. But it's so true. We've learned that to express ourselves and ask these kind of questions, and we just like, for some reason, we just don't give ourselves permission. We think of it as selfish. We judge. We dismiss. We're not worthy. That sort of thing. It's easy to fall there. These stories try to help us practice something a little different. Ask the questions we have. Express the desires that we long for, knowing that not every desire is going to be the ultimate. Oh, I'm at the highest peak. We don't live that way. Sometimes it's going to be the lowest of the low. It's going to be a low vibration thing. So what? Express it. Ask it. Because it clears out. It's like churning the soil of life. That's how things can grow. It's that simple. But we fall into these traps all the time, that I should just sit and be quiet and just accept things. All right, there's a place for that. There is a place for that, okay? We don't need to be like the group of women that were part of the ghost tour this past week that were heckling me and others because they had a little bit too much to drink. And they became the part of the show at that point. We don't always need to speak up in every environment, okay? That's part of it. But the truth is, most of us are a little bit, we err on the side of squelching ourselves, of staying too quiet, okay? We err on that side far too much, too often. It's about giving ourselves permission to speak, to ask. Cecily, I see your hand up.
Yes, I love that you're talking about expressing yourself. I think, you know, as a mother, it just seems natural to want to stand up for your children, to look out for their interests. We're kind of trained, you know, to do that, or it just is a natural part of life. And you know, if you look at God, He is our parent as well. He loves us and cares for us and is looking out for our interests as well. And it's just a beautiful thing to be able to express, you know, what's on your heart, and know that that loving parent or father or mother wants to know what's on your heart.
Yes.
And would love to help you.
Yes. It's so important to remember and to see stories like this, that we can so easily just point a finger at and judge and say, well, that's an example of someone who just doesn't get it. This mom asking for, no, what we need to see in this story is just what Cecily said. It's an expression. It's a part of the growth process of faith. This is how faith germinates. We ask these questions. We receive instruction. We open ourselves to be vulnerable, to ask the questions that we have. Look, faith is not a series of just mountaintop experiences where we get all these downloads of enlightenment. No, it's growth that happens as we stumble and fall along the path. I will remind us again, the name Israel itself means one who struggles with God. That is faith. So these stories are stories of faith. This question story, not the greatest question maybe, but it's a story of faith. She is embraced, she is received, she receives instruction. It becomes something that many benefit from. She had the courage to do that. That's a powerful expression of faith. But that's part of the deal. And it's just too easy for us to overlook that, you know, to really not see that as the story of faith that it is. Because if we don't have those moments, then the insightful moments often don't happen. Because we haven't cleared the space, or we haven't given ourselves permission to really become learners. You know, you don't learn how to ski by just getting on skis and never falling. Well, I don't know anyone that's done that. Maybe there's one. You got to fall a lot and you're going to get bruised and you might get hurt. It doesn't matter what you're learning, that's what it takes. All of those falls are part of the process. These questions, good or bad as they may be, same part of the process. That's where the training, I think, we can really benefit from. As we become practitioners of faith, give ourselves permission to fail, give ourselves permission to ask dumb questions, because there really aren't dumb questions, but you know what I'm saying. Give yourself that permission. Express yourself, you know? Good stuff. Okay, let's unless there's any other comments about this, that's really that covers what I wanted to kind of say about her. So I love what she represents in the canon here. And then lastly, let's get to another wonderful story here. Another wonderful woman, the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. Let's just do a portion of this one. It's let's see. Let's just start with, if someone online would be willing to read this. It's hard to do this one. It's hard to pick the spots here. I guess start with 31, verse 30. So it's John chapter 4. Let's go 31 to 42. With someone online, I know it's kind of in the middle, but I think you know a lot of the interaction enough anyway. That they've talked at the well a little bit, but this is part of this sort of picks up on the conversation once the disciples get there and they see what Jesus is doing, talking to a woman in the middle of the day. No. That's, or at least culturally, that's a big no. So someone 31 to 42. Do I have a hand? Bob, thank you.
Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, "Rabbi, eat something." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Surely no one has brought him something to eat." Jesus said to them, "My food is to do with the will of him who sent me and to complete his work. Do you not say 4 months more, then comes the harvest? But I tell you, look around you and see how the fields are ripe for harvesting. The reaper is already receiving wages and is gathering fruit for eternal life, so that sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor." Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. "He told me everything I have ever done." So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Savior of the world."
Thank you. So much powerful stuff there. I love at the beginning of this where the disciples are like, "Hey, have you eaten anything? Come, got you some food?" And he's like, "Listen, the food I'm talking about isn't that kind of food." And but it's just all about, well, no, you need the food. And it's the same way of misunderstanding that Nicodemus has. Okay, so it's once again this wonderful tension that John, the author here, is putting between the ones who are so-called insiders who kind of miss a lot of the point, whereas the whole interaction with the woman, the Samaritan woman, she gets it. And we know she gets it because her response is that she goes out and she tells, and people are really impressed and are moved by her, by what she shares. She's a powerful evangelist. And as he says, or as the story says, many came to believe, and he was very open to the Samaritans. Okay, and there's that interesting closing line that says, "And he stayed there for a couple of days and then they came back up and said, you know what?" It's kind of funny when you see it, I guess, a little bit. But you know what? It's no longer because of what you told us. We got to see it for ourselves. Okay, we got to learn it from first-hand sources. But thank you for your service. That's kind of the way it reads. But whatever. She's an important piece, not just for what she learns and not just for what she represents, but for what she does, how her faith is lived. That's how the Gospels show what faith is. It's never just about, oh, yay, I'm healed, I'm back, and yay, I can just do whatever I want. No, when we experience wholeness, when we experience healing, it leads us, faith leads us to go back and to share it in some way, not to just be isolated still. Faith brings, our healing brings us back into connection, into community. And it leads us to do that. Not as a way of saying, now you've been healed, Teresa, now you must do this. No, it's this natural thing that happens. That's what faith is, okay? So as we consider, what this story represents, the Samaritan woman, the relationship between Jews and Samaritans, think about in your own life, think about in our own world, who are the untouchable ones like that? Who are the ones that are untouchable in your life? Who are the ones that just you really struggle with in terms of wanting to include them in the greater circle? Look, we know that we ought to, but I'm asking you, who are the ones that give you the hardest time when you really say, okay, push come to shove, I struggle with these ones? Who are the ones that you would consider the untouchables in your own life, if you can come up with them? One that comes up for me is child abusers. I struggle with that. I struggle with that. Any other people you can think of that are just the ones that just make it hard for you to accept that they would be included? Not that they can't be, just harder for you to accept it. Okay.
Drunk driver.
Drunk drivers. Yeah. Yeah, because of the consequences often, right? Yeah.
When I worked in the operating room, it seemed like often it was the drunk driver that we were doing the operation on. The other people
Right.
he'd hit were already dead.
Right.
We're trying to fix his broken leg or something. And I had a
Right.
hard time with that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
I can't understand how people can take a life with a gun.
Okay, so so Joe is bringing up an example of someone who murders with a weapon, like
Yeah,
a
I
gun or
just don't
something.
understand what's going on.
Okay, so like a mass or any kind of shooting.
Yesterday,
Yes, at the school again, another school shooting in St. Louis. Yes,
afraid to send your kids to school.
yeah. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to sort of open up that space in our hearts. It can be. Anyone else? Who are the untouchables?
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, okay. People on the world stage that become just, they're sort of a persona non grata at a point. And he's really painting himself into a deep, dark corner from the looks of it. That's the way I feel too. I really struggle with that because of his choices and how it's just impacted not only Ukraine, but the world and the world economy and everything. It's impacted everybody. And because of what? Because of what looks like just an elective act of war to get access to, ultimately for money, and for economy, for access to waterways and trade and all that. Who knows? There's probably more. But yeah, okay, so that's a great example. People like him or world leaders, as we come to know who they are. Some people look at in our own country, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. Think about the attitudes that have been cast about certain people. And I understand that when you're on a world stage, our way of really knowing about people is filtered for sure. But there's a lot of personalities we could probably start thinking of that just push our buttons in the ways that make it hard to think that they would really be just as welcome here. But that is the darn challenge of faith. Okay, that is, I don't know why I said it like that, because I sound like a hick, I guess, when I say it, but that's the darn challenge of faith. Okay, that is the hardest part of what we're asked to do. To find those people that we think are untouchable, who may well be untouchable in our lives, and to recognize that that is not true for God. That's the hardest part, because that is where we learn the difference between that's judgment when we're in there. We're in our judgment, and we are asked to step out of being in the place of judgment. Not that we give up all judgment. We have to have judgment to live in our lives, but I'm talking about that judgmental, being judgmental. Okay, that's the difference. And that's what happens in this story. The judgmentalism that leads a whole society to reject people like Samaritans. And in the context of this story, she's the one who gets it. She's the good disciple. She's the woman who's wise. Okay, that's powerful stuff. And that's why these stories not only have lasted the test of time, but that's why they were so radical when they were written. Can you imagine a story where the person in this story was Vladimir Putin? Osama bin Laden? Okay, this is the point of stories like this. They're meant to push our buttons and to test the limits of what we think God's grace might be, and remind us that God's grace is always wider than ours. It's just the way it is, you know, it's the way it is. And it's easy to say that, but then when we get specific examples, whoa, we're confronted. We're confronted with our own demons, our own judgments, okay? And I want to just pick up on one more thing at the end. Do you find that you came to a sense of faith, a growth in faith, because of someone else? Or was it more because of your own personal experience with, say, someone like Jesus? When you came to faith, was it through someone else, or was it through your own kind of, I don't know, personal connection to spirit, or to Jesus, or to God, or to however you name it? Do you remember? I remember when I was 5, I saw a tree. And that was the first profound example of connection to God that I ever found. Because the tree was this little sapling. I've shared this before, so I apologize if you heard it, but maybe it's been long enough. It was this little sapling that had somehow been folded over, and it had this part of it, it grew straight, and then it folded over like a pretzel, and then it grew up again. So it was as if something had fallen on it for a while, and it continued to grow, and then the thing fell off of it, and then it kind of looped back around and grew. And it was literally this loop in the tree. And it just was like, that somehow spoke to me about the way life and love and everything works. And that just, you know, when that happened, I thought that tree should have died. That tree could have stopped living. That's what was going through my little head. And then I saw that, and it just made me feel so like there's something beautiful, there's something loving, there's something creative, there's something encouraging in the universe that tells that tree that it can still grow even when that happened to it. And you know, that's one of the reasons why I love Vincent van Gogh so much, because he saw the same thing in olive trees. That's why he painted olive trees so much, because they're such a gnarled, ugly, low tree that produces one of the most glorious products in terms of humanity. Not all of you are going to love olives, but a lot of us do. But it's a beautiful tree in so many ways, and yet when you look at it, they're just sort of this low, gnarled thing. And he saw profound beauty in them. Okay, so my experience started with an individual thing, but I tell you what, it was shaped by people. It was shaped by the conversations. So I'm wondering, what's hitting you? I shared that just to give you a chance. How did it start for you? What's your recollection of how faith started for you? Was it someone else sharing, or was it your own individual experience? Mr. Participation Award, Bob Childs.
Mr. Star Award. Well, my mother is very religious, and I was brought up in Christianity. And then I reached a point, though, in my life where I woke up one morning feeling very empty, because I was living a very materialistic life with no spirituality. And it was a great awakening for me, and decided I needed to do something about it.
Wow. Yeah, that's That's profound, because a lot of us feel that at different times in our lives, but a lot of us then go back because it's so seductive. But to get that sense of shift, you know, and sometimes it's true that it does happen. It can happen even in church. You know, like we've been raised in church all our lives, and then we are confronted with this part of ourselves. Look, there's no guarantees when it's going to happen, how, and it's like there's no insulating ourselves from the world. Just because we go to church doesn't protect us from all these questions. I preached on it the last 3 weeks, this whole idea of generosity and the pathway that it forms within us about just this embrace and this deeper sense of connection to spirit and meaning. And yet a lot of us still struggle with that. It's part of humanity. It's part of our lives. It's part of all the different things that we receive and the way we approach it. But yeah, it's there's going to be times in our lives where we're confronted with that. And that is an interior question a lot of times. It's like an internal voice. And then what do we do with that? I think it grows and it becomes, we get stronger in it when we have conversation about it, when we connect with others about it, when we again, talk about it, ask the questions. Don't be afraid or ashamed of the fact that it's there. Barbara.
When I was 5 years old, some of my friends had all been baptized as babies, and I never was. And I had a friend who went to the Baptist church. So I went to the Baptist church with her,
Yeah.
where after a year or so, I was baptized.
And you were baptized in the big tub up front?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a totally different experience,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
But I
so-
felt better after that.
Yeah.
And I went to the Baptist church for a number of years, even here in Auburn
Yes. Yeah.
on Bell Road, until they started firing pastors.
Uh-huh.
And Margaret Holbrook came to this church, and I was talking to her about it. So she brought me over here, and I joined here in 2005.
Wow. I didn't know all that. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's true that, you know, at different times in our lives, we have these internal kind of conversion type experiences or these desires, and baptism can really be one of those markers in our lives where we feel this deep sense of conviction, because baptism it's such a powerful expression of welcome within a community, of cleansing, of washing, of affirmation, of moving through, you know, our lives and through the waters to find our freedom. You know, it's a beautiful example.
Well, I think the problem was my mother was Methodist, my father was Episcopalian, and they never got together on a religious.
That can happen.
Yeah.
That can happen. That almost happened in my family, where my dad was Catholic and my mom was multiple different Protestant things. And outside of the priest basically driving my father away from Catholicism, because they insisted, well, if you're going to get married in the Catholic Church, you have to raise your kids Catholic.
Yeah.
That's not, hey, it is what it is. But he didn't want that.
No.
He didn't want that. And so, because my mom didn't want that. And so it just set him on a path. And they could have just done their own thing. And then it might not have led to me being right here with you today. You know, there's so many ways our lives are shaped like that.
Yeah.
Huh? You know, how do you end up sharing your faith? You know, this woman goes out, she's the classic sort of like the way she described that evangelist who's basically talking about Jesus. This will be the last question is, how do you tend to share your faith? What does it look like?
It's a good question.
How do you share your faith? And if it's not coming to you with clarity, that's okay, first of all, because you're on the spot. But secondly, I want you to think about it this week. How are you sharing your faith? I'm not asking how might you, I'm saying how do you, because you all do. It's not necessarily with words. You got that classic, is it St. Francis? Preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. There are a lot of ways we share our faith. Okay. Marilyn, I see your hand.
I think that my hope is that through living my life with love more and more and more at the center, in the core, that that people will see that and be changed by it in some way. if that's what's needed. I mean, I'm not doing it to try to change other people. But when you ask me the question, that is what I hope. I don't do it. I really don't do it through words, directly through words, unless somebody
Right.
asks me. If somebody asks me, then I'm very willing to talk about it. And that does happen.
So living your life on a day-to-day basis, being rooted in love, the choices you make, the people you open yourself to, being rooted in love and also kindness. I'm hearing.
Mhm.
But that those are ways that we do practice the gospel. That absolutely is it. Yeah, it sounds pretty straightforward and simple, but it is so powerful. So, any other ways that come up for you? And I'd like to even, if you want to jot down things that come up for you during the week or examples as you hear them. Because it's funny how you might be like, oh, I'm going blank, or I don't want to share that thing, or whatever it is. But give yourself a chance this week and try to jot stuff down or find a way to remember it. And then come back next week and I want to hear what are the ways that it actually came up, because I bet you'll be surprised how you shared your faith this week. Listen, you all shared it by just showing up. You realize that. Okay, you showed up today. That's sharing your faith. Okay, these are all different possible examples. Marilyn, did you have your hand up again, or is that just?
No.
Okay, just want to make sure.
I've talked enough.
Okay, and then we're going to get a final word from the STAR participant today.
Okay. Last Sunday, it was rewarding when Becca was asking the children what God was to them. And I really liked Wyatt's response saying he's the Spirit.
Yeah.
And I have shared my belief with people, I would say non-believers in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is good to learn how to put words to some of these things and to be humble about it, I find. Sometimes we get so ardent in the way we talk about our faith, and this is what it is, and it's easy to fall into that trap. But, there are times when words are helpful. And when we give ourselves a chance to play with it, and just don't worry about defining our faith, but describe it. How would you describe your faith? That gives you permission just to flow and talk if you want to. But beyond the words, okay, as we've been saying, as Marilyn and others have said, when I ask how you share your faith, it is not just words, but it can be. And I have a feeling that it is in ways that you might not initially consider to be the sharing of your faith, but then you're like, oh, I guess that is sharing of my faith. Whenever you tell someone you love them, that's sharing of faith. God is love, okay? That's what I'm talking about. Notice, pay attention to how you share your faith this week. I'd love to hear about, some of the ways it came up for you. Well, friends, I want to thank you again for another rich conversation. We have one more session next week, and then we'll take a break for a little while. I'm going to need a break through Shrek a little bit. But we'll come back together sometime around, I don't know, December, maybe January. We'll figure it out. But anyway, look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you all for your wonderful hearts and participation.
When do I get my star?
I was just looking on my computer to see if I could make a star icon here, but I just don't have it right here. I'm gonna have to I don't know. I'm gonna try to draw something. Anyway, you're a star, Mom. You're a star. All right, take care all. Bye-bye.
Right.